The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome. This is Lisa White from CML's Membership Services Manager, and it is a pleasure to have all of you here with us today for this fantastic webinar on the planning process, what elected officials should know. I think you're going to find this to be a very informative hour-long discussion just on a lot of different things that are going to be important to you and your roles in your cities and towns. Those of you that are elected officials and who have registered will receive 1 university credit. Today's presentation, the PowerPoint, is available on our website at cml.org under Training Materials. We are also recording it and it will be posted on our website later today. If you're not familiar with the webinar format, you should see a control panel to the top right of the screen. You have an orange arrow to the left of the panel which will minimize the entire box. All of you will be muted for the webinar, but we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the question box on the control panel. We'll address all questions at the end of the presentation. I do want to give a special shout out to APA Colorado. They are a co-sponsor of this webinar. It has been just a pleasure working with them, and I know that this information is going to be of tremendous value to everyone on the line. So moving along, I do want to share a little bit about APA Colorado. The Colorado chapter of the American Planning Association is extremely powerful and certainly popular in Colorado, so I want to make sure that everybody's aware of it. In fact, public officials are invited to be members of APA Colorado, so that is something that if you're interested in planning, I encourage you to take a look at. They offer training, resources, networking, conferences, fall conferences, as well as something that's coming up October 3rd through 5th in Keystone. So coming up quickly, but absolutely worthwhile, and I encourage you to take a look at it if that's something that interests you. Sheila Booth is their chapter administrator. Her contact information is at the bottom of the screen there. If you're interested, feel free to reach out to Sheila. She would be extremely happy to talk to you about the association. And of course, CML, got to do a plug for us. We serve 270 cities and towns around the state. We offer advocacy information and training. My information is listed there, as is my colleague Megan Dollar. She is a legislative and policy advocate who handles planning and zoning and those types of issues. So I wanted to make sure to give her a shout out if you have any policy or legislative questions as it relates to this issue. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to a fellow elected official, Anita Seitz. She's from Westminster, and she's going to be moderating today's webinar, sharing some perspective that she has as a fellow elected official. So again, thanks for participating, and we hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for participating, everyone on the call. Like Lisa said, my name is Anita Seitz. I'm a Westminster City Councilor. I'm coming up on my 5th year as a councilor in Westminster. And like all of us elected officials, I serve my city because I really want to ensure that our residents have a high quality of life. And I want to make sure that our future generations enjoy this high quality of life. But beyond that, I think most of us have aspirational goals for our community. Whether that's making sure we have areas of economic opportunity, that there's available affordable housing, public health benefits from having a healthy environment, good parks, open spaces, multimodal. So a lot of us have dreams of what we want to see our community become or how we want to make sure our community persists. And planning is absolutely one of the best tools that we have to be able to articulate that vision. So I was excited when I had the opportunity to participate in this call because it's really great for elected officials to examine how they make land use decisions when they have that quasi-judicial hat on. What are the criteria that's really appropriate for us to consider, and what are the pitfalls that can put our city in a difficult position? We have a great panel today of people who are going to be able to articulate that from the area expert point of view. But from my point of view as a counselor, I think that this is one of the most fundamentally important things that we do. With that said, I'm going to tee it off to Randy Hunt. He's a planner in Estes Park, and let him talk to you about what a planner wishes all of us elected officials knew and understood.
Take it away, Randy.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, rather. It's a beautiful day in Estes Park, and I would be remiss if I didn't start out by saying, please come visit us on every one of our 365 gorgeous days a year. We'll be glad to have you, and we will not object if you leave some spending money in our town either. Thank you for joining, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to present to you. My name is Randy Hunt, and I'm the Community Development Director for Town of Estes Park and surrounding Larimer County. Just a few words about that. We're unique in Colorado. We have the only true joint planning area, which is authorized by state legislation. There are other communities considering this, have over the years, but we actually enjoy the ability to plan for southwest Larimer County as well. We're about an hour from Fort Collins, and so that's of great value to the citizens. I believe we have both municipal and county officials, and I know CML is primarily municipal, but there's a great deal of cooperation with county government, and so wanted to make sure that everyone's aware of that. So into the presentation, what would we like our elected officials to know as planners, as planning staff? First item here is your packet materials and staff presentation are only the important tip of the iceberg. I think everyone's aware of that. If you've been in elected office, you've seen your planning staff and your other staff bring in, sometimes giant folders of stuff, and you, of course, don't have all that in your packets, so everyone's aware of that. The practical aspect of this bullet point is that we can share more information and we can answer questions usually much more efficiently and easily for you if you come by the office first or make an appointment for us to meet with you and review any question marks. Your staff reports are just summaries. They're important tips of the iceberg, but they are the tip. There's always a great deal more information, and we're happy to answer questions and share more info whenever you need it. There's a pragmatic aspect to this too, and that is that every planner, every professional staff member is occasionally got the question that seems to us to come out of left field in a public meeting. A lot of times the public, but sometimes the officials or other staff. And it's always much better if we can answer those at the prior stage before we get into the meeting. We'll have the answers ready. So that's our practical thing that will help us and you on the decision-making process. Next, we've got a clean choice item. I always want to be sure to mention this. And not all communities do this, I know, and some of you may not, have a staff recommendation up or down on your development projects or the items you're reviewing. I believe most places over the years I've been doing this, I've been doing this 31 years, and I believe all but one place I've worked has had a staff recommendation on a planning item for you. Those staff recommendations, we do our best to give you a clean up or down choice, recommend approval or denial, and if it's a project that has conditional approval, we try our best to give you conditions that are logical. That kind of feeds back to the first item where if the conditions aren't clear or you're not clear how staff got to the recommendation, we want to hear from you, preferably before the meeting, but during the meeting if there's no other way to do it, and be sure you understand the reasoning behind that. But we spend a great deal of time trying to get you to that clean up or down, and if conditions are involved, what conditions are part of the picture. Next, we have the simple yes or no cases. Every elected official, I think, seems like, well, how come every single land use project gets so convoluted that shows up on our agenda? Well, one reason is that land use is complicated. It's evolved. 31 years, I haven't seen any of the systems get easier. So I think that's just the nature of the thing. But we did want to let everyone know that it might seem like you always get staff recommendations with a lot of bells and whistles, or there's always some caveats. Part of the reason is that if your code's set up properly, the easy ones are ones that never reach the elected officials, not necessarily even the planning commission. They're staff decisions, and they're easier to take care of. If the code is done properly, then unfortunately the side effect of that is elected officials get the judgment calls, the gray areas. So you might feel like, well, everything is complicated, and a lot of things are, but we have some that never reach your attention unless something goes really wrong, and you'll unfortunately keep getting that. I don't think there's another way to go about it. My last item on this slide is we have the same community stakeholders you do, but our horizons are different. That goes to a specific element that's in the planning code of ethics, and other professions have a similar parallel item in their codes. As elected officials, you have to pay attention to today's constituents. You have to listen to those who are in the hearing room and are speaking at the podium. And that's important. It's an absolutely vital part of the process. You may wonder sometimes, well, the staff's come up with something that doesn't seem to sit well with the community, or with the developer. Sometimes our recommendations are different from what you're hearing at the podium, either from neighbors or from the developer. And part of the reason behind that, and an important point for us, is that in our planning code of ethics, we're required to plan for people who aren't necessarily there in the hearing room. It might be people who aren't here yet, who aren't in the community yet. In some cases, people who aren't even born yet. As I think it's Craig later on in our seminar has some good timeline information on how long building projects last, and they're oftentimes a good 50 years or more out. So we're planning for future generations. The elected officials always have to pay attention to today's constituents. This is when we deal with and understand all the time. I actually happen to come from a family with a number of elected officials, and I'm not an elected official, but at Thanksgiving dinner we sit down with my brother, the vice mayor of his city, and other folks, and so we always have lively conversations about, we're planning for 50 years out, and you guys have to listen to the folks in the room today. Sometimes that doesn't always come to the same point, but we agree to disagree sometimes, I guess. But we try to always let you know that that's the environment we're dealing with. So what happens behind the scenes, and what's the rest of that iceberg below the tip look like? This first one is a truism, and I don't think we need to dwell on it, but your staff projects, the staff presentations, what the developer's telling you, those items have a long lead time, and if the projects are done properly, the staff spends a lot of time with the developers. Through our public involvement, we hear a lot from the neighbors, from the community about these projects. Again, not to dwell on, I think most people realize that, but by the time it reaches the elected officials, it's often the final stage in a multi-act play, you might say, a multi-act drama. Again, another truism, you get a lot of calls and emails about big projects. We get them too. Over the years I've done this, I've noticed there's an interesting rhythm where at the first stage of the project, once the public becomes aware, they're calling us, they're calling you, they're emailing everybody. And as the projects go on, it seems like a lot of times the emails and calls shift more to the elected officials, and that's understandable because as things move toward a final resolution, that's where the decision making happens on the elected side. The key to this, I think, is mutual two-way communication. If you're getting contacts and we aren't aware of them on the staff level, but there are questions we can answer, please let us know, because a lot of times we can share prior history or some information on that. We're always glad to do that. The last item on this page is, it's kind of back to our previous bullet point on the other slide. One of the things that we hear a lot from our elected officials everywhere I've been is, it seems like the staff's always recommending approval. How come you never recommend denial? How come all these projects seem, kind of aimed at an approval outcome by staff recommendation? And there's a little more complexity to that. One of the things that is a truism in the development side of things, Carrie, I bet, can tell us more about this on her side in a few minutes, is that when the developers come in to see the staff, the practical reality is developers or their engineering firms always want to have a favorable staff recommendation. That's partly because that's the momentum of things, and partly because they're usually going to be dealing with the staff again. So one of the things you don't see is that there's sometimes the staff says, you can go forward with this project and it's your right and privilege to do that, but we're not seeing a way to get to a staff recommendation that says yes. Sometimes the developers say, I don't want to go forward with that mark against me. We'll figure out another alternative. So I wanted to mention that the elected officials do see a lot of favorable recommendations, but you may never see the ones that just don't get that far. And I think if we do our job properly, we anticipate what you as elected and the community as a whole need to pay attention to, and we give our candid judgment to the developers. This one just may not fly. Be aware and try anyway if you need to, but it just may not work. So a specific item that the lead up to the webinar asked me to deal with was meeting with the developer and what to know. I think a couple of our panelists have other thoughts on this, and I believe those are good thoughts. The first item, ex parte communication, the topic itself is wider than we've got time for, so I won't go into what all the nuances are there. But the general caution is always meeting for an elected official or planning commissioner to meet with a specific developer or development team after the application is filed. You've got to be careful with ex parte communication and not having a discussion that's outside the view of the public. I think most of us are aware of that, and it's good to avoid. Our elected officials always wonder, well, is there any alternative to that doesn't get us into trouble or doesn't start looking like it's outside the public view? Meeting with a developer in a group setting without a specific project on the table can be valuable. I would suggest should always be an open meeting where maybe not with public notice per se, but with the public available and welcome. That can be a valuable thing. In Estes, we do that periodically with our town board meeting with development community representatives, real estate folks, and so on in a study session or work session. And that tends to work out very well. One real quick practical example to show you how well that can work. One of the things that is always evolving is the banking and lending industry and how they fund development projects, what they're looking for on real estate and construction loans. And since the housing crunch in 2008, we've seen those evolutionary regulations getting tighter and tighter. We've had study sessions with our town board here that involved the banking community that they were very candid to explain, here's why we've got to deal with these things on a tighter basis nowadays. Here's some shorter timelines we have to deal with. Here's why you might feel pressure or hear about pressure to get projects done quickly. So not everybody gets to do commercial loans, and that's valuable information to hear. So those general meetings that are on particular projects, very useful, I think. The third item is on field visits. Now, this is a gray area, and we got to be cautious about it. Again, with ex parte or communication with the developer outside the public eye, that can get troublesome. What we'd like to recommend, field visits are always valuable, first of all. I think there's no substitute for seeing the site of a project. And if you're in a bigger community where it can be time and trouble, those aren't always easy to arrange. But I would suggest, good idea to try and make the time whenever you can. Try not to have the developer present with those. That's just your standard ex parte communication, but it's an important one. But your staff is glad to help you through that. Again, for open meetings records, you don't want to have too many elected officials on the field visit, but staff is willing. You know, I'll offer for our staff, we always try to meet one-on-one with the elected officials or our planning commission in the field. Make sure your attorney agrees. There can be pitfalls there, and make sure you have permission to go on the property and not with the owner present necessarily. So that is a valuable step. My final slide, this is a little beyond specific development projects, but it's one I always want to talk about. My specialty in planning, I have some interesting and odd specialties, I guess. One of them is I spent my whole career in either tourism or visitor-based economies or in college towns, which actually is a type of visitor economy. The visitors just stay around 4 years instead of a weekend. But you know, we've got that specialty, and that can make for some interesting variations in how you approach your code, because your visitors and those folks who come and go are harder to involve in the process. My other specialty in planning, or my topic specialty, is code writing. That's a strange niche in planning. Everybody's either long range and big picture and comp plan and 50 years plus out, or their development review and how many bushes are there in front of the parking lot, that kind of thing. So I'm in that middle ground. There aren't many of us, but I like to throw in a little piece about how to keep an eye on your code when we have to. Codes go out of date quicker than you think. A good example is vacation homes. That's a topic for a different day, but I can tell you in Estes and probably most of our Colorado communities where people like to vacation and enjoy themselves, vacation homes are a big issue. This is an area in our code we had to spend a lot of time and effort and do some fast updates because the phenomenon just came out of left field for us and for many. On that topic, variances are a leading indicator of coal trouble, and this is the canary in the coal mine. You know, I started my career in Appalachian, Virginia, southwestern Virginia, where there's coal country, and that's a real thing. I think there's a country music song about the canary in the coal mine. But in the old days, the miners used to take canaries down in the mine, and if there was too much methane or too many gases that weren't good for people, the canaries would tell you first by falling over with their feet up. They're, you know, not funny if you're a coal miner, a canary either, I guess. I always think of this analogy. If you've got variances to your code, variances are not glamorous, but they're a key piece, and elected officials don't always keep an eye on them. Your planning staff does. If you've got too many variances coming through on the same topic that your Board of Adjustment is dealing with, that can be a kind of canary indicator that you've got something in your code that needs attention. So this final caution is for revising and keeping your code update. Ask your Board of Adjustment, ask your planning staff, are you getting a lot of variances on the same thing? If you are, it's probably time to look at that code and do some attention to fixing it. So that's a real quick summary on a bunch of big topics. I appreciate the time, and I'll be here for questions.
Thank you so much, Randy. We appreciate your perspective, and now we're going to switch to the other side of the table. Carrie McCool with McCool Development Solutions, she's principal there, is going to talk about what she would like us to know and understand.
Thank you, Anita. This is Carrie McCool. I really appreciate being invited to speak on this panel today. 85% of my clientele is actually small rural communities across the state of Colorado providing municipal planning services, but we do represent developers. So I am looking forward to putting on my developer hat as we work through this presentation. This first slide really shows what developers are always the most afraid of. You know, the planning process is very daunting because of these public hearings, a lot of people coming out with pitchforks and not supporting their particular project. And that's why it's important, and I'd like to piggyback on what Randy had indicated, that developers really do want to head into these public meetings with a positive staff recommendation. So it's important that all of us, we all have different roles, and I wanted to talk a little bit about them. I get a kick out of this slide because I developed it along with my friends and colleagues with the Department of Local Affairs doing planning 101s across the state. And we came up with we need to tell everybody their roles, and we need to come up with pictures of, you know, what's the elected officials' role and planners. And of course, we came up with Rodney Dangerfield. This picture has been in circulation for over 16 years that I've been in business. So having a great time sharing it with you. So it is important to understand what their role is. They're responsible to learn and respect adopted rules and processes. They need to have an understanding of the role of government, communicate issues and concerns, and really have realistic expectations of the entitlement process. And that really is what developers call the planning process. It's entitlements to them. The biggest thing that I hear with my developer clients is predictability. They want to know what the rules are. Oftentimes, if they know what the standards are and what they're going to be held to, they're actually fine with that. It's all about knowing what they're going to get throughout the process. So elected officials and planning staff can make sure that predictability is met by having up-to-date long-range planning documents, having very streamlined land use regulations, having an understanding of your development review criteria is really, really important, and that there's no surprises. The thing that our developer clients really have trouble with is getting almost to hearing and finding that there's going to be some big extraction or some very onerous requirements that they weren't aware of, and they're going right into hearing, and it's this big surprise. So we want to make sure that there are no surprises through the process. Developers often want flexibility. Having waivers from code requirements in your regulations are something that developers like to see, and that kind of ties into you as elected and appointed officials having confidence in your staff, right? So if you've hired your staff to implement the code requirements, and do rely on them to use common sense and look at are there changes in the code that need to happen in order to make this project move forward. So that's always an important thing. Having resources available. A lot of the communities that I work in and that our developer clients like to see is having user-friendly user guides. These guides provide real clear submittal checklists. Developers want to know, what do I need to submit? Do I need a traffic study? Do I need a photometric plan for lighting? You know, what are these things that I need? And if it's in one clear checklist that they need to, submit all those things, they're willing to do it. Having examples of work product. What does your community, what are your standards as far as what your plans need to look like? What do your elected and appointed officials like to see in their packet? and having a tool for developers to follow that examples is really, really good. Knowing what the fees are, right, with developers, it's all about the money. Again, I guess no one's happy about paying fees, but knowing what they are up front and being prepared for them, again, all back on predictability, is really important. And to have online resources, having your websites up to date, having your user guides on the website. And a lot of communities are doing a really great job at that, so we need to keep that up. And communication is really the key. Randy touched a little bit on this as well. Everybody has their role. Effectively communicating is super, super important in every step in the entitlement process. Really lean on your staff. You've hired them as professionals to implement the code and to be represent your community. So it's important to use them as a resource to address any issues, hammer those conditions out, help them help your development community get to that daunting public hearing with a positive recommendation from staff is really critical. The development community has challenges. In Colorado, we have so many, we're a boom-bust economy, we're changing all of the time, and so don't hesitate to reach out to your the development community in general and try to get an understanding of what those issues that they are facing and invest in collaboration and education. A lot of times what we recommend is for tough topics to actually invite the development community to co-present and come to your community as more of a team as opposed to an adversarial relationship. An example of this is if you're updating your sign code regulations, what works really well is to invite someone from the sign industry, have a sign contractor, give their perspective. What are their challenges? And it really helps to provide that perspective. Public hearings, again, I need to circle back with that because developers want to make sure that they have an effective public hearing. And what is that? It's really everyone has had their opportunity to be heard, that relevant issues are addressed, that there's no rabbit holes. A lot of communities do a pretty good job of when they have a really contentious public hearing, they set the groundwork for, okay, we're gonna have 3 minutes for public comment. After the 3 minutes, then you're done, your time is up and no repeating comments. So developers really rely on elected officials to maintain and run effective public hearings, making sure people are that they felt heard, that they're understood, and that everybody really feels respected through the whole public hearing process. And what these public hearings are not, and I always have a slide to let everybody know that we need to be realistic about those expectations. Not everybody's going to leave happy. Not everybody's going to get what they wanted, and not everybody loves city council and town board. But that doesn't mean you didn't have an effective public hearing. So what are some tips for elected and appointed officials? Have a real thorough understanding of your long-range planning documents. Developers do look at those when they're identifying when they would like to invest in a certain community. They want to make sure that the vision of the community is in line with their project goals. Having updated land use regulations is really important as well. Again, following back on having streamlined development review processes. Not everything needs to go to a public hearing. And that your homework is completed, that your packets are read and elected and appointed officials come very, very prepared, and that they're familiar with the site as well and familiar with the developer's project. And Randy did a great job on discussing some of the tips on how to make sure you have successful site visits. And last but not least, what developers do is they really look at your approval criteria, and they really want to make sure that elected and appointed officials, they base their decisions on finding of fact. And so that's your approval criteria. For example, with rezonings, most communities have very similar criteria. If the change in the zone promotes health, safety, and welfare, if there's changes in your community that warrants the rezoning, those types of things. So it's just really, really important that when you're going through your motions and you're making your approval, denial, or approval with conditions, that you're really basing those on findings of fact. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Craig, who's with Aurora, and he's going to let us know about engineering.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Craig Pearl. I am a principal engineer. We've got a bunch of engineers in the city of Aurora. We are the third largest city in the state of Colorado. Give a shout out to the Aurora City Attorney's Office, who currently is listening on this, and also a shout out to Randy. I'm this weekend bringing my family and my money up to Estes Park, so looking forward to it. I probably have a very different perspective as an engineer. We tend to be very kind of black and white, cut and dry, and we, in many ways, are looking very much at the details. So I think some people might kind of reasonably ask, why do we need all these regulations? I've got, this is my city. I've got a whole, 3-inch binder. That's the roadway design and construction standards. I've got another 2-inch binders. That's the storm drainage design and technical criteria. Well, the reason for that is that the philosophy and laws that are in place in the state of Colorado and most other parts of the country at this point is all built on the idea that development pays its own way. So the developer, and I'm kind of thinking prototypically of a larger, say, residential or mixed-use development of tens to hundreds of acres. Developers are going to come in, they're going to build the streets, the storm drainage, the water, the sanitary sewer, all that infrastructure. They also pay some impact fees where they may design their kind of local stuff. They also pay, for instance, in the world of water, not just building the pipes within their subdivision that bring water to their residents, but also the pipes that bring water from the treatment plants to their community. They also have to pay to get water rights and other development. There's similar fees that apply for schools and parks. The flip side of that is that once everything is built, the municipality takes over the ownership and maintenance responsibility for all that infrastructure in the long term. And that kind of gets back to some of the same points that I think Anita was making about we want to, first of all, be good stewards of the city's funds. We want to have our current and future residents have good quality infrastructure, all these things that will make a quality community. Some of the points where we kind of get involved in that, actually very early on we were involved with the planning process in reviewing site plans, and even we start even before things have been submitted to lay out what some of the requirements are. We're engaged in the more detailed engineering review of design. I actually am in charge of a group of currently 8 engineers who do that work. We also have a similar group of inspectors who go out and make sure everything is built correctly during construction. And then kind of the final guarantee we have is there's usually, in our case, a 1-year warranty to make sure that everything works. For instance, that this curb and gutter doesn't settle and crack. Because once that year has passed, if we haven't made any claims, it's ours, and it's ours for a long time. So I talked about all the different binders of standards that we have. So our standards, there's a whole bunch of different organizations that create standards. I listed a few of the alphabet soup ones that we have, at least in the Colorado, Denver Front Range area. We've got Urban Drainage and Flood Control District. We have Colorado Department of Transportation. If nothing else, they have enough stuff organized that they're de facto standard for a lot of things. AASHTO is the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials. And a lot of their manuals deal with how we set up roadways and intersections, how quickly you can curve vertically or horizontally. Federal Highway Administration, they have the book on all of the signs. IBC's International Building Code, which is actually structures and also gets into drainage. So we're always looking at this, thinking about how are we going to protect health, safety, and welfare of the public. I bolded safety because that's, to us, is always central. And I say us, I think both as public officials, also as a professional engineer, that's really that's our creed, that's our primary focus, is trying to make sure that things are going to be safe. We also want to minimize future maintenance costs. And then these standards, I think there's some question. There's always ongoing debate about, why is Aurora standard different than Denver's and different than Arapahoe County's? There's probably some legitimate argument in there. It is meant to reflect local conditions, so I think it might be obvious that you're not going to have the same kind of roads, say, on an Eastern Plains community as you would in a mountain community. And then also community values, which is some of what comes down from the elected officials and through kind of planning and public processes. So an example of how that kind of community values comes into hard engineering standards. So Aurora, we are a city. That means certain things like we have roads with curbs and gutters. We have streetlights. And that's sometimes a little rough when we get on our kind of eastern edge where we're at the interface with some more rural parts of the unincorporated county. But that's what our community values are, and that's what we expect. I think others have used the term horizons or timeframes. Definitely, they are a little bit different. As an engineer, I'm expecting if we build a culvert, bridge, I'm expecting at least 50, really 100 or more years of life out of that with some moderate maintenance. Most of the infrastructure we have in this country was built shortly after the Second World War, and some addition and others, but that's what we think of because we don't have funds to go out and replace stuff in general. Personally, I think of if I see something that was built in the 80s being torn down, I kind of think that's a bit of a travesty that somebody should have been more forward thinking. But that's, I'm not, no offense or anything, I'm just talking about different perspectives. Residential and master developers, their business model is usually to get a large area of land ready for development, and then they'll start to sell off blocks of that to home builders or other individuals and entities who will do things with them. Those time frames tend to be more within 5 years or maybe 10. Big box retailers, typically those stores have maybe 15, 20-year lifespan, and I'm sure we can think of a lot of communities where there's a big box store and they just closed it up and moved down the street. So that's a very different, for some of those large corporations, they're making a very different assessment of their risks and their quality of construction. Now, I think some of the partners that we've worked very well with, some of the commercial, industrial, and multifamily developers, some of them actually will both develop and continue to own and then lease out that often for a long term. So definitely see the difference in perspective as we deal with different sorts of developers. So I guess I'm here from the engineers, but I also try to understand how the land development industry works. Something I've been trying to learn over a long time. Tip of my hat is I'm a member of Generation X, so I had to include the Scooby-Doo. It would have worked if it wasn't for you meddling kids.
I know, right?
So it's always the land developer who's the bad guy, and I think that's some of the stereotypes that still kind of persist in some ways. But I think some of the things to understand is, first of all, it's an industry. We do these call them pre-application meetings, where somebody who just has an idea of what they might want to do with a piece of property, maybe haven't even bought it or made an offer yet, they go in and do it. And I've found in general, there's really two kinds of people that I deal with from there. There's either people who do this for a living or people who are completely and utterly shocked. Because, I've kind of dealt with some mom and pop kind of people. They really, first of all, don't understand that they have to widen the 2-lane road that's in front of their property into a 4-lane arterial and put on sidewalk and street lights and everything else. But there are also players at different points in the process. I've lived and worked in Colorado. I've also lived and worked on the East Coast in different times in the boom and bust cycle. The industries are different. It is definitely not, the kind of Scooby-Doo model. You think somebody goes out, say, hey, Farmer Joe, you got a nice piece of property I can develop here. Here's a big pile of money. I'll take it off your hands, and then I'll start building stuff. It's a lot more complicated, and there are specialized players who will pick up a piece of that. There's definitely people who will pick it up, get it through the entitlement process, and then turn it over and sell it off to other entities. So trying to understand that industry, I think, is important. The other thing, you kind of have this, again, the Scooby-Doo picture of a developer with a big pile of cash next to them, and that's not at all how it works. Their cash flow is critical. They're doing commercial finance, especially they're doing commercial finance, is a lot stricter than it was before the recession. I've heard from some folks it's loosening up a little bit, but that's where we want to make sure that everything gets built. It obviously can't all get built up front before they build the first house. So thinking about how we're going to stage that out, both so that it meets the public needs, doesn't leave us with infrastructure gaps, but at the same time respects the developer's need to get their cash flow going. You say, you build this bit, then you get, 50 rooftops in, then you build this bit. That's kind of the process that we go through. So I found the best way to approach this is to look for areas of mutual interest, and also understand that we do have areas where we have inherent conflicts, and kind of lay those out and respect those. So, one more. And thank you for your time.
Great, thank you so much, Craig. I think that was incredibly helpful. And it is always good to think about other people's perspective, other stakeholders' perspectives, and where they're coming from and the time horizons they're working on. We're going to hear from Russ Forrest, the Gunnison City Manager. And as a city manager, I'm sure he has a very strong message for us elected officials on how we should approach this. So I'm very much looking forward to your portion of the presentation, Russ.
Well, great. Well, thank you. And I probably will echo a few comments from the previous speaker, particularly Randy. And I'm a planner, community development director turned manager, and been a manager for the last 10 years. Gunnison is a beautiful mountain community of about 6,000, where we're largely dependent on our 4-year university and tourism. So pleasure to speak today. And let's see if I have, just trying to advance. Let's see, getting back, there we go. So always a significant question, is it okay to meet and talk with a developer? And as elected officials, you are the gatekeeper to a developer's goals, which is usually to get a project approved. And if you're lucky, a developer is also interested in the long-term relationship with your community. And hopefully their goals may be somewhat aligned to the community's goals, and where they're not, that sometimes creates challenges. And it's understandable that a developer wants to actively communicate with the municipality and with elected officials, because they want to understand whether their project is consistent with the policies and the regulations of the community. They want to understand, is there a clear process? Is there precedent? Any other applications like theirs have come through before? And time is money, and so they're usually always very interested and how long will it take to get through the process. Developers might also be interested in talking to elected officials because they want to influence future policy. Maybe they want to change something specific like parking regulations or the actual process itself related to your land use code. So in kind of thinking about communication, it's first, and I am not an attorney, so again, I'll begin this by saying, please refer to your city municipal attorney whenever you have a legal question. But one thing they'll freely share with you is be cognizant of what role you're in. If you're in an application, if you're dealing with an application, you're in your quasi-judicial role. And a good friend and city attorney said, literally think about yourself in a judge's robe, and that all the communication really needs to be seen in the form of testimony that's done in a public venue, literally in court. But there's another role you're in, and that's a legislative role where it's all right and somewhat expected for community members and stakeholders to talk to you, lobby you about policy and potentially changing policy in the future, but you still need to be cognizant of that. If a developer is approaching you regarding a development application, you need to be cognizant of the timing. Has an application actually been made? But again, even if it hasn't been made, you have to be careful and very cognizant of that communication. Staff, again, and again, very appreciative of my current council when they get contacted by a developer. They're pretty consistent in terms of saying, would you please call staff first? And they'll give them, if it's a significant project, the town manager's my phone number, and kind of terminate the communication with that. Even if you don't have an active application, even if it's a legislative issue and a developer wants to talk to you about a parking requirement or changing a policy, it's still good advice and probably best practice to encourage that developer to communicate with the full council, send a letter, send an email, so that interest can be shared with the full council so that the council as a whole gets full and clear communication, and then that issue can be discussed publicly in a meeting. So even though legally it might be okay to talk about a legislative issue, or it might be, and it depends on your attorney's opinion, to discuss something before an application is made, you got to recognize that perception is reality, and particularly in a small community, you need to be very careful about that communication. Also, you need to be cognizant about various ethical rules, and Randy mentioned APA has a set of code of conduct and a set of ethics, so does ICMA. Also, a lot of our communities will have in our code ethics that can be binding, and if you don't follow them, can create some significant issues, and there's certainly, again, state code related to appropriate communication, and you need to be aware of that. And again, with most onboarding processes, and that's something city managers and city attorneys need to be very aware of, and usually are proactively planning for and conducting, is onboarding processes so that new elected officials and planning commissioners receive that basic training. So some recommendations. When in doubt, simply, if you get that call from Mr. or Mrs. Developer, refer that developer to your community development director, your manager, your appropriate staff person. Also, be aware that if you have an active application and you get cornered in the produce aisle from a member of the community, you need to have the wherewithal and the ability, and usually, maybe even practice a reason why it is inappropriate to have that conversation in the produce aisle, and encourage that individual, that concerned citizen, to come to that next public hearing, come to that meeting, and have that discussion with all the elected officials. Things become a little bit murky, though, if you're talking about a public-private partnership, and A lot of us will enter into public-private partnerships, say with a housing project. And before entering into that, a developer may be very interested in understanding the relationship and how different council members are aligned around an issue. And one way to deal with that is oftentimes we'll have a request for proposals, we'll be very clear about the expectations, and maybe even integrate into that, how do you have open and frank discussions with a developer where there's going to be some form of public-private partnership, and understand the parameters around that deal in the context of a development application, which may be the result of that public-private partnership. Again, stay close to your city town attorney. If you do get that call or you get cornered in the produce aisle, oftentimes, and again, if that happens, chat with your city attorney, and they'll often share with you the idea of simply disclosing that communication depending on the nature of that communication. And again, if you're dealing with a public-private partnership, and again, that developer is calling council members, wanting to get a sense of the disposition of individual elected officials, one simple way to do this is simply to have a work session and have a very open, honest discussion with that private developer. Sometimes there'll be proprietary information that needs to be protected. But in the best public-private partnerships that I've been involved with, always tried to push for kind of an open book policy so that the pro forma, the numbers associated with a public-private partnership could be shared publicly when possible. Another key role of the manager is ensuring good communication. And one thing I always encourage a developer to do is to implement what I call the good neighbor policy and talk to the affected stakeholders, adjacent property owners, before an application gets anywhere near City Hall. I mean, the reality is, soon as an application is made, things begin to get polarized, positions begin to get taken, and so the extent a developer can facilitate good communication with stakeholders, with adjacent property owners, makes the process certainly not perfect, but it certainly helps with the communication. I've heard from a number of NIMBYs that when that occurs, that they at least appreciate the respect given in the form of that communication. Another role the manager has is ensuring that there's good internal communication and that there's systems for internal communication. One of the things we do is interdepartmental meetings with larger applications, and we make sure everybody that has an interest or a role in the development review process is actively participating in a discussion. They all understand the relevant regulations, policies, procedures, and that we're sharing issues, concerns, and opportunities with a specific development application. And again, one of the goals with this is certainly making sure that the developer is not hearing different or inconsistent messages about policy process or what they need to do at the end of the day to move forward through the process. And one thing, again, just to go back to a point Randy made was, one of the things we always like to do is how do we get to yes? And that means right up front working as a facilitator with that developer, which also means making sure that everybody's perspective is understood, from emergency services to transportation interests to the planner, and that we're figuring out ways to hopefully achieve the goals of both the community and the developer. But that also sometimes means being very upfront right at the beginning, saying, nope, the road you want to go down simply is not accommodated by our current regulatory framework, but here's an alternative way that could potentially get you there if that's at all possible. So again, a real key role, I think, of the manager is making sure that there's good internal communication, and that also includes with other stakeholders such as CDOT, the county, utilities, if that's applicable, to make sure, again, all of the stakeholders are brought in early with the development application and that their perspective is heard. Another key thing that we just did with a large project is, so after it is approved, making sure that, again, there's clear communication and coordination before construction actually commences, making sure various conditions have been addressed that may have occurred in the development review process, the development improvement agreements are done appropriately, and then planning for the specific construction-related impacts, because that's often with large projects when phone calls begin to occur to council members and town managers is, again, when people, adjacent property owners, are surprised by the actual construction of a process or a project. Staff has the responsibility also to ensure that recommendations are based on the land use code and that we're, again, facilitating the process to the extent possible. I've worked with planners that hate making recommendations, and that's certainly a role of the managers to make sure that recommendations are clearly articulated and that they are based on the city's applicable code. Sometimes you've got to prompt elected officials to ask questions. Again, everybody has different personality and communication types, and sometimes you have to nudge a little bit. And you know there's questions that are out there. Sometimes you have to prompt questions. Again, and the manager needs to ensure that your process is respected and followed, or you get certainly into issues if you don't follow your own process, and that can sometimes come with a 106 claim. No one likes surprises, neither the developer or the municipality. So again, whenever there's problems or issues, and things will always change and unexpected things will happen with development applications. So always ask a developer, let us know. If a problem happens, you can't fulfill a commitment, let us know. And likewise, if something happens on the government side, that we share any issues with that. Again, managers and city attorneys will inevitably always have to remind and reinforce roles. Another thing that I found, particularly with very amicable planning commissions and city councils, is that it's all right to have different opinions. It's all right for staff to have a recommendation that may not be popular with an elected body or a planning commission. It's all right if different elected officials have different opinions. Just so, particularly with the elected officials and whoever's voting, they're clear about their rationale for their vote, and that their opinion is based and their conclusion is based on the code. Another role of the city manager is, when there is a procedural problem, to hit pause and sometimes stop, and to have a full discussion, and that often, again, includes that city attorney and the elected official or planning commissioner that's involved. You know, in a small community, conflict of interest is an ongoing issue. Somebody's wife works for the developer or is good friends with the developer. That often case is not a problem, but sometimes you have to disclose the relationship. If there's some sort of monetary relationship, then sometimes that elected official has to recuse themselves. Ex parte communication, again, is a real tough issue in a small community. I had an issue with an elected official riding a ski lift. You're on that lift for 15 minutes, and they happen to be riding up with a developer third person in the ski lift overheard it, and they talked about the weather, they talked about the skiing, but they also talked about the application, and that was enough, and that went to court in a 106 hearing, and the judge said, whoop, you got to do a do-over, and you're, Mr. Councilmember, recused in this do-over. Process errors. This just happened. We had a marijuana application, and the address was wrong. My city clerk came in with her head hung low and said, oops, I blew it. And I said, well, you know, we've got to simply renotice it, get everything correct, because if we don't do that, then we not only expose the city to liability, we also expose the applicant to a potential do-over in the process. So again, you got to have the strength to say, sorry, we need to do over, we need to get it right. What becomes tougher is if you go through a process, you go through that public hearing, and then you realize you have a procedural error, whether it's a notice, ex parte communication, and again, sometimes you have to replay that hearing, that meeting. That becomes a lot more difficult. If you get into hot water, CIRSA is a great source of help. If it gets real sticky, and again, you know, having that open discussion with your city attorney and manager is really important. Again, manager has to ensure that you have an environment that's safe, so that staff members and elected officials will disclose problems. Hopefully you can do that up front before you've gone through that public hearing. And again, when those problems happen, you got to have the strength to sometimes hit pause and correct them, even if that's a little embarrassing. But at the end of the day, that's the correct way to go to protect the integrity of the process and to ensure that you don't have an approved project which may be subject to a legal challenge in the future. So again, you know, kind of a legal perspective on things to be careful of in the development review process, you know, from a manager's perspective, and hopefully we have a little time for questions.
Hi, Russ. This is Anita, and I'm going to start with my first question for you. I'm so happy that you spent that last slide talking about the different liability a municipality can face when it comes to land use decisions, and really how we have to be careful. I was concerned without a city attorney on here, we might not get into that area. But I think it's important for everyone on the phone to define what a 106 claim is. Remembering some of us elected officials probably never heard of a comp plan, right. Let alone you know, the code requirements prior to getting on council, so are probably even less familiar with the 106 claim.
Well, if a city attorney was on the phone, I would let them kind of describe the specifics of Section 106 of the state statute. The short version of that is you have to follow your own process. And in terms of the development review process, notice requirements, ex parte communication, and if you don't, then you are vulnerable to a legal challenge. And again, I've been through 2 106 claims, one won, and then the one we didn't win was an ex parte claim where it was just really clear we had an elected official that had a discussion outside of a public hearing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's important that we follow our own process, not just because it's the right thing to do, that it's equitable to all involved, but it's also a source of legal liability for the community.
So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and type it into the question box on your computer, and we will direct that to the proper people here at CML and remotely. There was a question somebody asked if you can get a packet of the presentations, bullet points, and topics. The PowerPoint that everyone did is saved at cml.org under training materials. Just click it and it'll be one PDF with the entire PowerPoint presentation. So that is available. Feel free to get it from there. But if there are any other questions, feel free to type them in now. Do want to mention that CML's upcoming district meetings are coming up quickly. September and October, we'll be traveling around the state, so hopefully you've heard about those meetings coming along. We're going to be busy and traveling, and we hope you'll attend at cml.org under Outreach. You'll see that schedule. We're hitting a lot of communities, and please encourage you and your colleagues to join us at the one near you. So I'll give one more minute for questions. I'm not seeing any. I think that the presentations. Oh, sure.
So this is Anita Seitz again, and I want to thank everyone who's participated on the call and all the people who are still on the call. I think that we've heard a lot of really great advice for to help us frame how to look at land use decisions, and I think it's really valuable. I did notice on the roster that we do have a lot of staff, and so if I might be so bold, I wanted to talk about what I think is one of the fundamental things that empowers a city council to make good decisions, and that's trust. So making sure that we understand your area experts, that you look at things on a long-term horizon, what's going to promote public value for this community, really facilitates that trust. I also think it's important to understand that if there are dynamics in the community that aren't addressed in the code criteria, it is helpful to present council with basically language that shows that the recommended, the staff recommendation addresses those. So it's going above and beyond, and you don't want that to be the criteria for the decision, but you do want to allow the council to be responsive to their body. So I guess I would say make sure that you're understanding the tensions that your council is faced with too.
Excellent. Great. Thank you for that. Wanted to mention also that again, this recording will be posted to the CML website, cml.org, under training materials. So if you have a colleague that perhaps wasn't able to participate and you think they would find this valuable, feel free to send them that link. Well, with that, I want to thank all of our presenters and thank all of you for spending time with us today. Hope you found it to be a valuable webinar, and have a great rest of your day.